Well, welcome everybody to the first crew video that is filmed nowhere. We are in the internet, but we are today coming from some very interesting places. And because of a recent video of ours that blew up online featuring our special guest, Kate, we decided to bring her back and dive into this interesting topic that is disputed borders, autonomous zones. So welcome, Kate.
Thank you.
And of course, you know Eric. For those that don't know Kate, I'll do a very quick little intro here. Kate Edwards is a geographer, cartographer, and culturalization consultant who has worked in the IT and video game industries for 28 years. She has a specialty in issue of boundaries and territorial sovereignty. So let's go quickly around the world. Everyone can say hi and tell us where you're coming from today.
Thanks for joining us, everyone. I'm in Seattle, where that infamous video that Viv referred to was filmed with Kate and myself. I'm sitting here with a background with the Sons of Liberty, which in my country was a fundamental flag in 1775 as a particular group of people decided that they were going to form their own nation and establish borders. And most of you might not know, but this is the beginning of the American flag. And I look forward to asking a few really hard questions to you, Kate.
Awesome. Well, I'm looking forward to answering them. And I am coming from the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. This is the Dome of the Rock Mosque behind me. I stood almost exactly in this same position back in early February this year. It's one of the last international trips I took before the pandemic hit the world. And yeah, this as far as disputed areas go, this is at the high top of the list for the global list.
Also, another region that we have come from is Antarctica. If you've watched the crew episodes, we've been here, but not specifically to the South Pole. While there's not warring armies, there is, I understand, a disputed claim over that stick. So without further ado, let's jump into it, Kate. We have been around the world, as I mentioned, to a bunch of these kind of bizarre border areas. What is an autonomous zone? What's a disputed region? Can you give us some definitions?
Yeah, well, it really kind of all rests on the idea of sovereignty. And the word sovereignty, which references to having a crown and a monarchy and to having some kind of royalty that oversees, that basically has sovereign power over land. And that's really our modern system of countries and territories and all of these things in international laws is based, what is often called in international law circles, the Westphalian model. That essentially set up the model that we live by today, where we actually have, territories that are well defined by borders, and there are jurisdictions that are defined by borders, and we have a regime of international law that dictates how we can cross the borders, how we interact as different actual nation states. And that is actually in human history, that's really recent. I mean, that's only within the last 200 or 300 years that idea even existed. Because before then, it was basically, you had empires and you had duchies and kingdoms and all these things, depending on the physical feature. Like they could say, my kingdom stretches all the way to the Danube River, and that's where it stops. So if you have a well-defined physical boundary, oftentimes that served as a convenient boundary. But actually codifying the boundaries and putting it on maps and everything is fairly recent. And so coming back to the concept of sovereignty, that basically implies that somebody has control over the land. And today it's much more complex, actually. A lot of it's based on history and it's based on law. So to be autonomous basically means you have a certain control over your territory, but to be autonomous doesn't always imply that you are like completely self-governing.
So the academics and the political gobbledygook around that aside, I mean, basically, aren't we saying if I have more guns or bigger guns and more grain to sustain sitting behind those guns, I've got a country?
Yes. In short, you could. And because generally speaking, to have a country or to have a well-defined territory that could be recognized as a country, it always requires three things. Usually you have a fairly homogeneous group of people who are kind of banded together in common cause. You also have control of the territory, which kind of brings up the military aspect, or having the force to maintain that territory. And that is actually a big part of sovereignty, and it's a big part of having control. And then also the third part of it that often needs to be represented is that they have some kind of body that can represent the collective interests of that people and of the territory. And that's generally what we call a government. And so you usually need those three things in order to start on the path of how does that space then get recognized as being like officially a country.
How fragile are these agreements that we have right now? It seems that one, they're just an agreement that might not be able to be enforced. Two, you mentioned a monolithic body of people. We were down in Seattle in the CHAZ zone, which was associated with Black Lives Matter. How unique is it that we see these monolithic groups around an idea versus an ethnicity or culture?
We have throughout history have agreed to kind of you keep your space and I'll keep mine. A lot of ancient empires did that, and it was predicated only on, well, it was usually because you didn't want to piss them off and because they have a bigger military and they can take you over, and or maybe they're a good trading partner. Maybe you have a good relationship with them and they have things you want and you have things they want, and so it can work together really well. But to your second point about having an identified group, it doesn't have to necessarily be around a specific ethnicity or a specific creed. It has to, but there should be some kind of common cause. Like with the example in CHAZ that we saw, there absolutely is a common cause between all those diverse people who are in that area.
But circling around to your explanations of these different types of regions, two places Eric and I have been is Xinjiang, China, which is Xinjiang Autonomous Region, and there's Jammu and Kashmir, and I'll throw Hong Kong in. So they all have different names. China seems to be tolerant of having autonomous zone in its country. It hasn't like taken it over and gotten rid of the title autonomous. And then what's happening in Jammu and Kashmir that's different from Xinjiang?
Well, there's two levels to this. One is the actuality of what it is from a legal standpoint. Within the nation of China, you have different kinds of regions that exist. You have special administrative regions, which is Macau and Hong Kong, because once they reverted back to Chinese control and when Macau reverted in 1999 and Hong Kong in 1997, they were made special administrative regions, but with different rules, and that's why they were called special. Where something like Tibet, in that region, they call it autonomous, and there are other autonomous regions in China. And a lot of what that signifies, that's more of a legal definition within the Chinese system that says that within their government, there's certain level of control that is allowed locally, partially because, let's face it, a region like Tibet is pretty far away from Beijing. And, they need to be allowed to make certain decisions and have certain, controls in place that are unique to the region because it is a unique region. I mean, it's, high mountainous region. You've got a different ethnic groups than like the Han Chinese who populate most of China. And so you need to do some kind of allowances for that. And that's basically what they've done. However, from a practical political standpoint, does anyone really believe that Tibet is autonomous from the central Chinese government? It isn't at all.
So what you're saying is that if I'm a country like China and I would like to get back part of my country, I would just go in and take it. I mean, if it was me, if I was Xi Jinping, I'd just say, hey, Hong Kong, yeah, it's mine. Whatever, guys.
At the moment, a lot of it comes down to economics. As much as a lot of the world depends on China, China also depends on a lot of the world. And so they run the risk of having the EU and the United States and other, blocs, Asian and Southeast Asia. And you have the possibility that all of these factions will basically cut China off, which if they group together, they could possibly do that, and it would hurt the Chinese economy. China doesn't necessarily want to risk that, especially as they are positioning themselves at their desires to grow as being seen as one of the world's major superpowers. But in order to get to that point, you can't necessarily be a complete tyrant. At the same time, just to your point where you said, why don't they just go in and take it? Well, that's exactly what's happening in the South China Sea over the last 5 to 10 years. So they basically, over the last decade, decided, you know what? We're just going to go in and start building fake islands and occupying them and even fortifying them with the military. And who's going to stop us? And so far, nobody has.
So then jumping not too far across the globe into Jammu and Kashmir, which recently has flared up, comparing that to what you've just described in China, how is that different?
So what's different there is that you have a region in northern India, the whole Jammu and Kashmir region used to be its own country. What happened is that when the British were pulling out, and that's when the actual partition happened, so that was the creation of Bangladesh, that was the creation of Pakistan, the separation from India, all of that happened. Part of that whole process was the creation of what was called the McMahon Line. And McMahon was a British statesman who basically sat down and decided this is where we're going to draw the line to divide Pakistan from India, India from China, and so on. And yes, that line remains highly controversial to this day. And in the case of Kashmir, what had happened is that what they called the princely state of Kashmir, which was its own country, was basically trying to decide, what are we supposed to do? You know, and the idea was that they would remain in their own country. Well, because Pakistan asserted a claim over part of Kashmir, the prince of Kashmir basically panicked and called on India for help. So India came rushing up to the north to help the prince. Well, what happened as a result is that Kashmir as a state virtually disappeared, because now that the Indian forces were in Kashmir and the Pakistan forces were in another part of Kashmir, and at the same time the Chinese went and took over another part, which is called Aksai Chin. And so you had these three forces, China, India, and Pakistan, basically rushing in and filling that vacuum of power.
Pakistan directly on the other side of that range, and China just over here.
We're still living with the reality of that collapse today. That is exactly the result.
When Viv and I were up there, I think a week or two before we went up into Kashmir, Jammu, we went up into Leh Ladakh. There were some Chinese forces that had kind of wandered over the border into India at the time. Over on the Pakistani side, there was a firefight while we were there. And so my question is, having Viv and I sat there in the region, what is it that you want here?
There's many layers to this. Part of it is historical claim. Part of it is national pride, which we know a lot of these issues get tied up into national politics very closely. And I mean, for example, when I was doing my work as a geopolitical strategist at Microsoft, at one point when I was in India, I met with the Surveyor General of India, who runs the Survey of India. And he is the person responsible for establishing the maps and maintaining the policy that Kashmir must always be shown as Indian territory in any map that's ever out there. The interesting part, though, is he took me aside and he said, you know what, between you and I really don't care. I know what's going on up there. I've been there. I've lost friends up there on the top of the glacier. And he's like, but it's all political. So he's like, I get your pain. I know you would like to show it as ground truth, as being a disputed territory, because I know for a fact that's what it is, because I go up there. But I'm not allowed to show it that way. And oftentimes, actually, in international law, being able to demonstrate a claim goes a long way for, like, if this case was ever taken to the International Court of Justice in The Hague in the Netherlands, showing that you've had the claim and maintain that claim is really important to actually having the court sway in your favor.
It seems to be more powerful than actually occupying the land and defending it legally, is the ability to convince other countries' populations that this is yours. For instance, I would think it would be much easier to do a bit of a propaganda campaign where if I had all the Americans thinking, yeah, South China Sea, yeah, it's China's. I mean, they've been there a while, they're doing a thing, you know.
Is that Israel? Is that what Israel's done?
Yeah, and then I put pressure on my government saying, yeah, they're good. I don't have to go to The Hague. I got the
Well, no, you're absolutely right. I mean, that's actually where that kind of brings up the focus of the work I've been doing for all this time in IT. Why does it matter that I've been doing this, focusing on geopolitics and culturalization in IT? The reason is because that is the battleground. The image of what is out there in the world, the cartography that we present is the battleground, because it's a fight for mind share. That's why the government of India and the government of China both require that the map, whatever the map is, if it's Google Maps or in an atlas or something, if that map is sold in those countries, it has to conform to the government's viewpoint. Otherwise, it's not going to be sold. And this happens all over the place. You know, in Argentina, they still call the Falkland Islands Islas Malvinas, and they show it as Argentine territory, even though they lost the war with the UK back in 1982. You know, Morocco shows Western Sahara as Moroccan territory, which it kind of de facto is, but not 100%. And this goes on and on and on. So you do have a point. If you can convince the populace, convince general people out there in the world, whether using maps or something else, if you can convince them that this territory is ours, then in the long run, you may not really need the ICJ to solve this for you.
Well, why does a country give up its territory? Why would they ever do that? Why not just say, screw you, I'm keeping this, and it's not like China's going to go in and take
vote,
it.
Vote for Eric for president.
But see, that's the very point. It's like, will they not go in and just take it? A lot of what we're talking about, though, it really expresses the absolute delicacy of the system. In some governments, like we've seen in Russia lately, like they just rolled into Crimea. Nobody seemed to care.
Putin and I were thinking the same.
Yeah, you guys would get along.
So we've talked a lot about this kind of this strong arming and military and control and stuff. Talk about some of the kind of peaceful ones, or the ones that are not yet really, guns aren't out yet. I prefer to the poll to start with. How many regions are there around the world where people have claimed stuff and then they don't really fighting over it?
Well, yeah, Antarctica is a great example of basically, I wouldn't even call it a Cold War dispute. I mean, it is disputed without question. Antarctica is a disputed area. You know, of course, a lot of it represents states that are down in the southern hemisphere: Chile, Argentina, and you know, the Russians, British, the Americans. We don't really have a claim per se, but we have our base at the South Pole, and we've got another one on the coast. I believe it was 1951 or 52, somewhere back then, there was all of these countries signed the Antarctic Treaty, in which they essentially decided, and they clearly decided, that Antarctica would be reserved for peaceful scientific purposes. So most countries have stuck by it. That doesn't mean they can't lay a claim. And they do. I mean, like Argentina is fervently reinforces their claim. You see it on every one of their maps. You'll see, you know, not only Argentina, you'll see Islas Malvinas, the Falkland Islands, and you also see this little sliver, like pie slice of Antarctica. And they should put that on postage stamps. Yeah. They put that on all kinds of things. And Chile tends to do the same thing.
When you take a look at Antarctica and you're saying it's for scientific research per the Accord, etc., you look a little deeper. And all the areas occupied down there are occupied by military forces.
Yeah, we saw a Chilean warship down there sailing around.
Well, I mean, to me, that's not surprising because, I mean, like even the U.S. military, if you want to go to Antarctica, you're going to be flying on a military plane to the South Pole. You're not going to have American Airlines or some other domestic entity fly you there. And so to me, it makes sense because you are very much on a frontier zone.
It's an interesting one because you need other sovereign lands to launch from to get to Antarctica. If it is New Zealand or Australia or Argentina or Chile, you kind of need to have a friendly relationship to kind of launch your ships and your planes from.
Well, one other thing I think is really interesting to note, especially in the face of climate change today, is what is sovereignty going to mean when you don't have land anymore? So if you take the Maldives as an example, this is a country, a full-fledged nation state, and they are based on the fact that they've got their archipelago. It's basically a huge collection of atolls that are very low elevation. I mean, they've actually had some of them already disappear due to the very slow sea rise. Well, it's already estimated that it's probably going to be just another, maybe 20 or 30 years or so, where the Maldives may not exist anymore. So what happens to the country? So they no longer have land as the basis for their sovereignty, and yet they do have a people and they have a government. And so I know there's at the UN, they're already having discussions about the notion of what do we do with basically landless states? What happens to them in terms of representation, the kind of power they have in the UN, the kind of voice that they have, because effectively they don't exist on the map anymore, and yet they do exist as a people. If they take that step and open up that kind of regime to a virtual state, there are a lot of self-declared virtual states out there on the internet that are going to want in on that action.
No, that didn't work out terribly well in the Middle East with Israel.
Yes.
Giving, just say, hey, here's your land, guys. So they have to solve it a different way.
That's right. They had displaced people, and we gave them some land, and we're still fighting over it.
Exactly.
This has been a super interesting topic, and as we've kind of just touched on, you kind of see the way everyone's talking here, that we can kind of deep dive into all of these. I'd love to do a deep dive into Israel, and Eric's got some ideas about, he'd like to set up his own country, and we know his policies on taking land. If you have any questions for Kate, we're going to do a Q&A video likely.
Put them down in the comments. All the questions in the comments would be awesome.
But otherwise, thank you so much for joining us, Kate.
Thank you.
Coming from the West Bank or in Palestine there. Eric from the original state of America and from South Pole, we thank you so much for having us on the virtual crew.
And if you want to see more from the places that we spoke about in this video, you can click on all of the links that I've put around us. We've got Jammu and Kashmir, we've got Xinjiang China, we've got Antarctica, Hong Kong, and Israel and Palestine. And that subscribe button is pretty interesting too. You should check that out.